Good afternoon and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host, Ergün Kırlıkovalı, and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at mythsandrealities.com. In episode 26, we learned that Armistice between Turkey and Britain was signed on Mudros, on October 30th, 1918, and British Navy controlled Turkish waters and Allied troops took possession of key positions. On March 16, 1916, Allied military officially occupied Istanbul, along with other key parts of the Ottoman Empire. Some 144 prominent Turks were arrested and deported to Malta. They were accused of three categories of alleged offences. 1. Failure to comply with armistice terms. 2. Ill treatment of British prisoners of war. And 3. Outrages to Armenians in Turkey and Transcaucasia. Andrew Ryan, who had served as interpreter in the British Embassy at Istanbul for 15 years before the war and was known as a Turk-hater and schemer, arrived at Istanbul in November 1918. He renewed many old contacts with native Armenian and Greek informants. With inputs from them and the Armenian Patriarchate, several blacklists of alleged Turkish war criminals were drawn up. On February 1919, the Tevfik Pasha's government invited 5 neutral governments of Europe, namely Spain, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Switzerland, to contribute 2 legal scholars each to a blue ribbon committee created to investigate the charges against Turks. This move clearly shows that Turkey had nothing to fear about the alleged war crimes, as guilty people do not invite independent investigators to expose potential war crimes. The British Foreign Office, alarmed upon this daring Turkish maneuver, decided to obstruct it. One would think that Britain should be happy to see a neutral committee investigating the allegations. But Britain did just the opposite. She prevented a neutral investigation. Any discovery would embarrass Britain because of the wartime propaganda and outrageous lies in the blue books, defaming and demonizing Turks, Germans, and others. That is why Britain destroyed all the documents in the Wellington House, Britain's propaganda office during World War I, right after the war. In the morning of March 16, 1920, all the Istanbul official buildings, including the Ottoman Parliament, were forcibly occupied by the troops of Entente powers, and many prominent Turkish nationalist leaders were arrested. In retaliation, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, the leader of the Turkish National Movement, ordered the arrest of some 20 British officers in Anatolia, including Colonel Rawlinson, who was the younger brother of Lord Rawlinson and a relative of Lord Curzon, the British Foreign Minister. On August 10, 1920, the notoriously lopsided and unfair peace treaty of Sèvres was imposed upon the Ottoman government. The treaty, described by Mustafa Kemal Pasha as a death sentence for the Turkish nation, was never ratified. After the successful conclusion of the Turkish War of Independence in 1922 and Lausanne Treaty in 1923, Sèvres Treaty was shredded and thrown into the trash bin of history where it belongs. The British government doubted whether the Turkish deportees at Malta, arrested by the word of some zealots, were guilty. The law officers of the Crown abstained for ethical reasons for formulating charges against the deportees featuring a catch-all concept like crime against humanity. On February 8, 1921, the Attorney General informed the Foreign Office that he was concerned only with 8 Turkish deportees accused of ill treatment of British prisoners of war. He suggested that the High Commissioner at Istanbul should be asked to prepare the evidence against those 8 Turks. The Governor of Malta, too, suggested that some of the Turkish exiles should be released and the remaining ones be informed of the charges against them. Thus, the crucial question of evidence against the deportees was now raised by both the Governor of Malta and the Attorney General. But no such evidence existed in the British archives in London, and Lord Curzon was hoping to get incriminating documents from the British High Commissioner at Istanbul. On March 16, 1921, Sir Rumbold forwarded to the Foreign Office long-expected details of charges against each of those persons. Andrew Ryan explained how these accusations were drawn up. I quote, "In practice, we have gone on the principle that sufficient presumption of guilt existed against all members of the governments of Turkey at the time when massacres and relocations took place, and all persons so high in the councils of CUP had to be credited with share in directing its policy. If this is the principle, then it seems to me that all these people should stand trial. This appears to me the only logical course," unquote. This is nothing less than a lynch mob mentality used by vengeful Turk-haters to draw up claims against Turks, arbitrary claims. Instead of respecting the bedrock principle of law, which is presumption of innocence, a vigilante justice based on presumption of guilt was used to level charges against Turkish deportees at Malta. Sir Rumbold, in forwarding to London the evidence against the deportees, wrote that very few witnesses were available, that the Armenian Patriarchate at Istanbul had been the principal channel through which information had been obtained. He admitted that under these circumstances, the prosecution will find itself under grave disadvantage, but he hoped that the American government could supply a large amount of documentary information. Sir Harry Lamb, one of Rumbold's collaborators, wrote the following, I quote, "No one of the deportees at Malta was arrested on any evidence in the legal sense. In many cases, we have statements by Armenians of differing values. In some cases, we have nothing but what is common report and an extract from a printed pamphlet. It is safe to say, therefore, that dossiers, as they now stand, would be marked no case by any practical lawyer," unquote. For the officials of the British Foreign Office, such a result was obviously disappointing. They still maintained their efforts to secure prosecution of some of the deportees. For that purpose, they requested assistance from the United States of America and the British Attorney General. On April 1, 1921, all available evidence were transmitted to the officers of the Department of Law. In reply, the law officers stated again that they were concerned only with the 8 detainees accused of cruelty to British prisoners of war. As to the others, the Attorney General believed their detention or release involved a question of high policy and was not dependent on legal proceedings. Thus, the Attorney General refused to involve himself with the alleged case of Armenian massacres, and he carefully refrained from pronouncing the word massacre, so freely used by the Allied wartime propaganda machine and by some politicians. Law officers stated, I quote, "Our difficulty is that we have practically no legal evidence and we do not want to prepare for proceeding which will be abortive. We asked Washington if the Americans could produce any evidence of massacre against the internees," unquote. Lord Curzon informed Sir Geddes, that the British ambassador at Washington, Geddes, that there was a considerable difficulty in establishing proof of guilt against the Turkish detainees at Malta. Curzon requested that Geddes ascertain if the United States government are in possession of any evidence that would be of value for the purpose of prosecution, unquote. On July 13, 1921, the British Embassy in Washington returned the following famous reply, I quote, "I have the honor to inform your lordship that a member of my staff visited the State Department yesterday, the 12th instant, in regard to the Turks who are at present being detained at Malta with a view to a trial. He was permitted to see a selection of reports from the United States Consuls about the atrocities committed in Armenia during the recent war. The reports judged by the State Department to be most careful, most useful for the purposes of His Majesty's government being chosen from among several hundreds. I regret to inform your lordship that there is nothing therein which could be used as evidence against the Turks who are being detained for trial at Malta," unquote. There was no evidence against the Turkish deportees and therefore no prospect of success of prosecuting them before a court of law. All political attempts of the Foreign Office to secure the conviction of innocent detainees thus failed in presence of dignified English jurists. An official of the Foreign Office wrote, I quote, "From the letter of the Procurator General, it appears that the chances of obtaining convictions are almost nil. The American government, we ascertained, cannot help us with any evidence. In addition to the absence of legal evidence, there is the extreme unlikelihood that the French and Italians would agree to participate in constituting the course provided for in Article 230 of Treaty of Sèvres. On the other hand, we certainly cannot release any Turks until our own prisoners are returned," unquote. It was impossible to detain any longer the Turkish prisoners in Malta as actual offenders. From now on, the British authorities were keeping them as hostages against British prisoners in Anatolia. Before a final decision regarding these hostages, the High Commissioner at Istanbul was asked if he had any observation. Sir Rumbold was informed that His Majesty's government must contemplate the release of the 43 Turks who remain at Malta. In Istanbul, Sir Rumbold asked the opinion of the English judge Lindsay Smith and that of General Harrington's legal advisor. Sir Lindsay Smith stated that he accepted the Attorney General's opinion as conclusive and that an abortive trial would do no more harm than good. In conclusion, he said that the only alternative was to retain Turkish deportees at Malta as hostages. General Harrington added that there was no longer any good purpose served by maintaining these persons at Malta at public expense, and that they might be used to obtain the release of British prisoners. In this context, Sir Rumbold wrote to Lord Curzon that failing the possibility of obtaining proper evidence against these Turks, which would satisfy a British court of law, we would seem to be continuing an act of technical injustice in further detaining the Turks in question. In order, therefore, to avoid, as far as possible, losing face in this matter, I consider that all the Turks except the 8 charged with cruelty to British prisoners should be made available for exchange. Both the Foreign Office and War Office were now in favor of exchanging all Turkish detainees except the 8 against the British prisoners in Turkey, and the law officers of the Crown concurred. Lord Curzon informed Sir Rumbold on September 27th that the British government was ready to repatriate all Turkish deportees at Malta, including the 8, in exchange of all British prisoners in Turkey. On October 1st, 1921, all Turkish deportees at Malta went on board HMS Chrysanthemum and HMS Montreal, and the ships sailed for Turkey. When they were released, the deportees refused to sign clearance certificates and stated that they intended to make indemnity claims against the British authorities for their forced and illegal internment at Malta. Chrysanthemum and Montreal arrived at Inebolu on the south coast of Black Sea on October 31st, 1921, and all deportees of Malta landed safely on Turkish soil. At the same time, all British prisoners in Anatolia were handed over to their authorities. The episode of Malta thus ended. To sum up, these prominent Turks accused of Armenian persecution were arrested and deported without any serious investigation. The principal sources of information of the British High Commission at Istanbul were some local Armenians and the Armenian Patriarchate. There was, from the very beginning, a great deal of doubt whether the accused persons were in fact guilty or not. Admiral Webb wrote in March 1919 that in regard to massacres, question of evidence will be extremely difficult. French authorities were against these arrests and relocations, which they considered as political measures. Admiral de Robeck wrote in September of 1919 that it might be very difficult to sustain definite charges against these persons before an Allied tribunal. Indeed, no one of these deportees was arrested on any evidence, and there was no dossier in legal sense. From the political point of view, it was highly desirable for the British government that at least some of these deportees should be brought to trial. The British Foreign Office has left no stone unturned to prove that an Armenian massacre took place in Turkey, and consequently, some of these detainees were guilty. But all the efforts of the Foreign Office in this connection ended with a complete failure. There was no evidence, no witness, no dossier, and no proof. The Armenian Patriarchate furnished nothing incriminatory. The Turkish capital, Istanbul, was under Allied occupation, and all Ottoman State archives were easily accessible to the British authorities in Istanbul. Yet, the British High Commissioner was unable to forward to London any evidence in the legal sense. There is nothing in the British archives which could be used as evidence against the Turkish detainees at Malta. The State Department was also unable to assist the British government with evidence against these Turks. It appears that what took place in Turkey during World War I was not a massacre but a relocation. The Armenian minority in eastern Turkey revolted against the Ottoman State at a most critical time in recent Turkish history, when Russian armies launched an offensive against Van and in the east, and the Allied troops landed on Gallipoli Peninsula in the west in April 1915. The Ottoman government then decided in May 1915 to remove the insurgent Armenian minority from the war zone to the Syrian province of the empire until after the war. Some 700,000 Armenians out of a total of 1.2 million were transported from Anatolia to Syria in difficult conditions. The empire was suffering from severe shortage of vehicles, food, fuel, clothing, and other supplies, as well as fighting a large-scale epidemic and famine. Turks as well as Armenians suffered much from the ravages of foreign invasions, domestic marauding bands, raids, feuds, and a civil war within a world war. Under these conditions, far too many lives were unfortunately lost. But Armenian casualties were no greater in percentage than that of the Turks. Grieving Armenian suffering and ignoring Turkish suffering is selective morality. It is unfair and unethical, not to mention inhuman. We should all grieve for the enormous human suffering, not for the suffering of one ethnic group or the other. We should grieve for all. These facts were deliberately misinterpreted and distorted by the dishonest Armenian nationalists and racist propagandists. Then the British and French intelligence services, on their part, spread throughout the world the stories of imaginary massacres for the sake of their own political purposes. Since the Ottoman government did not hesitate to declare a jihad or sacred war against them, the Allied governments obviously excused themselves for having so much propagandized these stories and sufferings of Christian brethren under the Muslim Turkish yoke. This propaganda was still exploited at conference tables by some British politicians. To wage a propaganda campaign and to prosecute innocent people before a competent court of law were two very different things, as the British Foreign Office found out during the Malta Tribunal. Sir Gordon Howard, the British Attorney General, was probably aware that no massacre was planned by the Ottoman officials and no planned massacre was ordered or carried out. He thought that all charges made against the Turkish officials and officers at Malta were of quasi-political character. So it was impossible for fictitious charges to withstand the scrutiny of a competent court of law. As a result, all Turkish detainees at Malta were released and repatriated without being brought before a tribunal. And that is a story behind the Malta Tribunal that never was. The prisoner exchange, the smokescreen reason that the Armenians cite to discredit Malta Tribunal, among others, was rejected by the Turks, as Turks demanded an all-for-all exchange. Contrary to the British wishing to end the matter to get the British POWs back, it looks like the process was prolonged. The Brits, wishing to use their Turkish prisoners as hostages to ensure the well-keeping of the British POWs, by 1921, the British had exhausted all avenues of finding genuine genocidal evidence after wholeheartedly searching everywhere for over 2 years. There was no other reason to keep the Turkish prisoners beyond mid-1921, except as hostages. The British realized that their last hope was gone when the American government, the British ascertained, could not help with any evidence. Thus, the Armenian narrative collapsed completely with the surprise collapse of the Malta Tribunal due to lack of evidence. Will this information help the Armenian diaspora see the plain truth? Will the Armenian diaspora finally accept the Turkish-American offer of civilized dialogue and reasoned discourse? Please join me next week to find out. Thank you, and see you next week.